Welcome to InFocus with Ejaz Haider. This program is supported by the Center for Security Strategy and Policy Research. CESPR is an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore, and it tackles issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments. This program is part of that effort. On the night of February 26th, 2019, an Indian Air Force strike package targeted a seminary in Balakot in the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province using Israeli Spice 2000 strap-on guidance kit that can convert a general purpose and penetration warhead 1,000 and 2,000 pounds into precision standoff strike weapons. In the recent four-day conflict with Pakistan, India used Israeli-made Harop and Heron drones, Spike missiles, and Barak 8 ground air defense systems. As the world's largest arms importer, India has become Israel's most reliable buyer, accounting for 37% of its total arms exports. As a matter of fact, Anthony Lowenstein, in his book, The Palestine Laboratory, puts the figure at 43%. As today's discussion will reveal, India and Israel's military relations are not new and go back to the 60s, much before the upswing we've seen since the coming to power in India of the right-wing Hindutva government of Mr. Narendra Modi. There are joint ventures now like Adani, Albert Advanced Systems, India, which is one of the joint ventures that they're doing. Reports have also revealed that other Indian companies like Premier Explosives and the state-owned Munitions India are actively supplying drones and weapons to Israel as it continues its genocidal war against Palestinians in Gaza and the occupied West Bank. The two entities, Israel as an illegitimate settler colonial state and India as the oppressor of Kashmiris and other indigenous tribal groups in the Northeast and the Red Corridor, have much in common. Both make false claims to being democracies, but both are fired up by evil ideologies of Zionism in Israel's case and Hindutva in India's. In the most ironic twist, Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, the pater familias of Hindutva and the RSS, supported Nazism, but also Zionism. For instance, Dr. Vikram Vasana wrote an article titled Nazism and Hindu Nationalism. And this is what he wrote, and I'm actually quoting from what he wrote. Savarkar commended Hitler for unapologetically representing the cultural and racial solidarity which had ostensibly prompted the country's 1870 and 71 unification. If Jewish culture was imagined as undermining this, then for Savarkar, German anti-Semitism was simply an outcome of natural politics. Equally, he said, and this is Savarkar, that if the Zionist dreams are ever realized, if Palestine becomes a Jewish state, it will gladden us almost as much as our Jewish friends. This duality runs through other Hindu supremacist leaders like Golwalkar and many others. The idea of ethno-religious purity is the same as Zeev Jabotinsky's, the father of Likud Nexus, essay The Iron Wall and Savarkar's treatise on Hindutva were both written in 1923. India and Israel today, the latter a pariah by all evidence, are now in a tight embrace. The similarities between the two entities need to be brought out with vigor and consistently, since, as Noam Chomsky said, they, as in India and Israel, fit together like hand in glove. My guests today have done just this kind of work, intellectual, historical investigation into the natural linkage between India and Israel. So let me introduce Azad Essa, whose 2023 book, Hostile Homelands, The New Alliance Between India and Israel, is the peg for today's discussion. Essa is an award-winning South African journalist, writer, and documentary maker who's worked at Al Jazeera and since 2019 has been at the Middle East Eye. He has also written for several international publications and currently lives in the New York metropolitan area. With him is Linah Alsaafin, a Palestinian journalist and writer whose work has appeared in Open Democracy, Al Monitor, Middle East Eye, the Times Literary Supplement, and Al Jazeera. She has also written the foreword to Azad's book. So thank you so much, both of you. As you can see from my introduction, I am unapologetically very clear about the fact that I have skin in the game when it comes to Kashmir and Palestine. And therefore, I do not and cannot tolerate, even on my program, which I've done with quite a number of Jewish scholars, including one Israeli, Avner Cohen. And I made it very clear to them that my approach to these issues, well, in this case, Palestine, is essentially about the facts on the ground, the historical facts, which inform my analysis. So both sidism is something that I'm not particularly fond of when it comes to either Kashmir or Palestine. So, Azad, let's begin with what got you to write this book and what got you to make this link between India and Israel.
Thank you so much for having us on your show. I really appreciate it. So, where to start with this topic? So, I'm South African of somewhat Indian origin. My parents were also born in South Africa, but my grandparents were born in India, this was pre-partition of the subcontinent. And so, growing up in South Africa during the end of apartheid, we heard a lot of stories about how India had been involved in the anti-apartheid movement, and that it also had been a strong proponent of Palestinian rights. And so, I grew up with these ideas of India being part of the non-aligned movement, being historically anti-colonial, and it was always the case that that India was framed as a friend to the oppressed of the world in a way, right? And then you have the other dimensions of leaders of Nehru and Gandhi's sort of caliber. Then you have this picture of this place, right? And so I had this really particular idea of India growing up, and you know one of my first memories, growing up as well, is that around 1990, Nelson Mandela was released, and the moment apartheid began to dismantle, the first country to end the sports boycott on South Africa, was India. And I remember waking up early in the morning to watch, a game, right, between India and South Africa, a cricket match in Eden Gardens. And the reason I bring this up is because, in my imagination as a kid growing up, there was this idea that there was something changing in my country, and therefore another country that had showed solidarity was also, reacting to that change. So there would be some kind of, something had to give before, a country becomes closer to you or changes its policies. So I'll get back to that point in a second. But when I studied in India for a short period in the early 2000s, my idea of India also got a bit of a slap in the face because it was during the time of the BJP's run, in power in the early 2000s. And part of that experience was my introduction to Kashmir in Delhi, right? And meeting Kashmiris, reading about it, learning about it, and then later going to Kashmir around 2007 and getting a complete shock at the kind of militarization, the kind of suppression that exists there. And not to give you a long story, but when I went to Palestine several years later, around 5 years later, 2012, and this is when I met Linah, and Linah took me around Palestine. I immediately saw the connections between the two. And so it's a strange thing that, although I knew about Palestine, but not as much, but my introduction to Palestine came through Kashmir in a way. And so now, as part of this discussion or part of this issue, is that I was working at Al Jazeera at the time, and to write about Palestine was not that difficult, right? It still isn't to a large extent, but that's a more complicated issue as well. Um, the idea is that you can write about Palestine, okay? And yet, when we started thinking or talking about trying to write about Kashmir or about India's excesses on its own population within India, we received a lot of sort of obstacles regarding that, or faced a lot of obstacles. And so there's this idea of India that people have, and then there's the reality of India, and so I was tracking this for some time, but I think the main thing is that after 2014, when Modi became prime minister, and he started peeling back this deeper relationship between India and Israel, it allowed others to sort of start thinking about India and Israel a bit differently. but it also allowed me to sort of like, you know, basically dive into this topic. But more precisely, in 2019, when India removed Article 370 from the Constitution, and basically removed essentially the semi-autonomous status of Kashmir, and then Indian diplomats started like hinting and mentioning that there was sort of an Israeli model that they were kind of wanting to follow. I decided that, you know, I was going to like revisit my interest between these two places and basically dig into it.
Yeah, 2004. This was when there was some degree of normalization between India and Pakistan. So there was a delegation of 8 journalists that went to occupied Kashmir from Pakistan. I was part of that. And I traveled by road from Amritsar to Jammu, and then I insisted that we must travel by road to Srinagar, which we did. I was amazed to see that every half to 1 kilometer there were these military and security forces pickets, and when we got to Srinagar, it was like literally an open prison. I mean, this is much before we started talking about Gaza. The fact is that I was struck by the heavy militarization, and I, given my own background, I started looking at the various badges and all that, and I realized that almost every conceivable army unit and central police unit and other paramilitaries were present. Elements from them were present in occupied Kashmir. I will return to the nuanced way in which you have investigated the historical background between India and Israel. But let me get to Linah, because Linah has written this superb forward. And I'm assuming that this was the time when you were based in the occupied West Bank, because I've seen some of your clips where you actually shaming the. I was quite, I was like, thumbs up for that, shaming the Israeli occupation forces soldiers. I'm sorry, I don't call them IDF, I call them IOF. So, and funnily enough, it's also the same for the Indian occupation forces. So there's a bit of a linkage there also in terms of even the the abbreviation. So you took Isa, Azad Essa around, and I'm assuming that you're not living in the occupied West Bank now. But from what I've seen, because I haven't physically gone there, but what I've seen through documentaries and other clips and all that, and also another really good book by Il Weissman, which is about the occupation architecture, the forensics of that, which I thought was a brilliant book. And how it kind of conceives of the hegemonic design in terms of subjugating and the slow structured violence against the Palestinians. So give me a sense of, obviously, what you have experienced personally as a Palestinian in the occupied Palestinian territories, and also, since you wrote the foreword to the book, in terms of how you kind of conceived. Obviously, I'm not sure if you've been to occupied Kashmir, but if you haven't, how did you sort of, make that connection between the two?
So just to comment on your first point about shaming Israeli occupation soldiers, I think there's no shaming them. They're too far gone beyond that point. The sense of entitlement.
You were trying your best, though.
I consider that a victim of like young hubris, let's say. I wouldn't do it again, to be honest. I wouldn't waste my time on them. But to answer your question, so starting with the second part, I actually had been to Kashmir in 2018. Yeah, so it was a year before Article 370 was removed from the Constitution. And Kashmir, like to me and to my circle of friends, when we met Azad, obviously it always existed in this sort of abstract concept. Like we knew that there were similarities. We knew that, much like Palestinians, the Kashmiris were occupied by Indian forces. we knew that, for example, the images from the uprisings in the early 90s, I think it was 1990, of young Kashmiri boys and men throwing rocks at heavily armed Indian soldiers. That obviously resonated with our own images of the first and second Intifada, especially the first Intifada, where the entire generation was known as like the children of the rock, and it kind of like solidified the whole David against Goliath image, where Palestinians armed with rocks against a very heavily armed, militarized occupying force. But again, you can never really know a place until you've actually been there and you see it with your own eyes and you converse with the people on the ground. And, going to Kashmir was one of the most enriching experiences of my life. I remember arriving at the airport and then just, going to like the place of accommodation and being absolutely like shocked by how heavily militarized the entire area was. So you're talking about checkpoints every 100 meters or so. And I think Kashmir is one of the most, if not the most heavily militarized areas in the world. I think it's about, correct me if I'm wrong, Azad, but I think there's about, on average, 8 Indian soldiers to 1 Kashmiri resident. So I think I was there for about a week. And again, there were a lot of similarities, like you see, I think I mentioned in the forward, not to use this word because it's been, or not to abuse this word because it's been overused so many times, but like the resilience of the residents, not in the sense of like some sort of like hero worship, but it's just more like these people, they live their reality and they have to live their daily lives and get on with it, despite all the obstacles and all like the oppression around them. So I think I mentioned, like the shops, they gave me a very similar vibe to the old cities in Palestine, the old Palestinian cities of Nablus and Hebron, for example, in the West Bank. And I think also when Azad came to Palestine a few years earlier in 2012, he also kind of like, made that connection as well, where it brought things closer to home and it tied things together. Life as a Palestinian under occupation, it's, I mean, to put it bluntly, it's brutal. It's funny because the last time I was there was in 2018. And after being away from home for so many years, I kind of look back about like my time during there. Like I went to high school and university and I worked for about a year there. So I look back at that time as something like, we never acted as victims and we never wanted to be the victims and we never wanted to, embrace that role basically, which is what Western media likes to portray us as. At best, if we're not terrorists, we're perfect little victims. But being outside, the country, it just kind of throws into light how abnormal and how unnecessary and how like unjust the entire system is. So when I say that the occupation controls every aspect of your life, they control the schools that you go to, they control who you can marry, they control where you can live, they control, if you can, if you can build like an extension of your house or not. And most cases, they obviously they refuse that. So it permeates your every, like every single cell in your body, basically. They almost get inside your head where it's like, oh, well, since they control everything, then what's the point of resisting? But then resistance comes in different forms. It's not just, throwing rocks or whatever. It's also, again, not to use a cliche, it's also by like staying rooted to the land. It's, by maintaining presence there and going about your life, because this is what the Israelis and their, the entire Western political imperialist class, this is what they don't want to see. Basically, they want to see us kind of roll over and die quietly. And I think almost 2 years into the genocide of the Gaza Strip, where they've thrown everything but the kitchen sink at, this besieged population, and they still can't, make them die quietly. So I think that speaks volumes as well.
Yeah, and much before the October 7th attack by Hamas and into what I call the occupied Palestinian territories outside Gaza, uh, there was that year had recorded um, the worst Israeli atrocities in the occupied West Bank. And I was at pains to tell some of my guests on this very program that you really don't take a snapshot view of what happened on October 7th. You have to contextualize it and see what was happening before October 7th.
Of course, yeah.
And I'm also very fond of sending them works from Hassan Kanafani and Darwesh and Raja Shahade and others. Anyway, the point is that this is something that, as I said earlier, where the only way forward is not to be apologetic and not to fall prey to the categories that have evolved over the years by the Western imperialist, and this is an imperialist outpost, Israel in any case. So, Azad, as I was saying, you went back and back to the actually pre-partition. You went back and said, okay, this was what the Congress was saying, but at the same time, Congress was also looking at the Hindu Mahasabha and how the Hindu nationalists were approaching this entire thing. And then come independence after that, how Mr. Gandhi was approaching this issue and how he very subtly changed his position. Ditto for Mr. Nehru. And then, of course, you also mentioned the 62 Sino-Indian War and how Mr. Nehru was trying to get help from Israel in terms of, military munitions and all that. So all of these things were kind of, at the one level, they wanted to have the kind of relations with the Arab world where they could essentially a win-win situation on both sides, that you reach out to Israel also, you maintain relations with the Arabs also. Then, of course, post 1967, again, there's a turn that happens, and then it proceeds forward. So there have been all these ebbs and flows in terms of India's policy towards Israel, which I think is a very good part of your book. Just briefly, tell our viewers what exactly would you call a watershed moment? Is it came before this Hindutva government? Did it come during Rajiv's period? Or did Rajiv's period basically prepare the turf for how the Hindutva governments were going to approach Israel?
Yeah, that's a tough question in terms of a watershed. We're always looking for the fork in the road. Like, when does something change, right? I think the 60s are very important if we want to look at, if you want to locate something. But I wouldn't say that it's only the 60s, right? So I would say the early 60s, when India goes to war with China, and it needs assistance, and Israel comes to its aid rather. And I think, we know about the stories in 65 and then in 71, right? But one of the things that's sort of underestimated is the 67 war in the Middle East, right? The 6-day war, as so called. And one of the things that takes place after the 67 war in the US is that, in many ways, that Holocaust industry begins after 67. This is when you have organizations like the ADL and others sort of really, knuckling down on pushing this agenda where the US and Israel are sort of like, bosom buddies, right? And that had a lot to do with Israel's victory in 67 and the occupation that, that part of the occupation that begins, right? And what we underestimate is how other countries viewed Israel after 67. So what I mean by this is that, India is still like, projecting itself as very much pro-Palestine. But after 67, the army and other elements within the political establishment are thinking, maybe we're on the wrong end of this issue. Maybe we should be working closer with Israel because they can assist us. And you must remember also that during that period, the US were not really sending arms to India. India was getting its weapons from then the Soviet Union, and so there's this anxiety about creating a home-based indigenous type of military industrial complex, and Israel is projecting itself, in that period as sort of like the sustained sort of innovative hub, right? Meantime, it's sort of getting, assistance from the U.S. South Africa is helping Israel at the time as well. So I think the late 60s are really important. It's also really important when Indira Gandhi comes in during that period and throughout the early 70s for the narrative with regards to how India and Israel, or at least how Delhi projects itself as being close to Palestine. What I mean by this is that while India starts to publicly become more hostile towards Israel, it recognizes the PLO as the legitimate representatives of the Palestinian people. It signs on to 3379 at the UN that calls Zionism racism. So there's this public hostility that's escalating, but privately they're basically training with the Israelis. And so that part is happening in the 70s. And so there's a narrative, that's being pushed. And yet at the same time, there's sort of a change that's taking place, if you want to call it in the deep state, in a way, right? And I think that part is really important and underestimated.
Which is why I said that you have this very nuanced, analysis of that period in which India was trying to do two different things, seemingly two different things. But this very resolution that you're talking about, as you mentioned in your book, ultimately India basically went ahead and when Israelis said to the United Nations that they need to revoke this resolution. And India went along with that. So as a matter of fact, it's really interesting that at some point, it's not just today, it's previously also the United Nations actually did the right thing, frankly, in historical legal terms. It's quite another thing that in terms of realpolitik, we have been witnessing for the last 20 months, we have been witnessing for once in human history, a genocide unfolding in real time on camera, which basically begs the question of the much touted values about human rights and various other rights. And it's the same kind of thing with reference to Kashmir also. And privately, there are lots of Western scholars who tell me, with reference to Kashmir in this case, that they believe that what India is doing in Kashmir is not the right policy. But nonetheless, they will not voice it openly. And the governments will not voice it openly. Even as, for instance, occasionally the US State Department would bring out its annual human rights report and maybe, chide India for doing this or that. But at the end of the day, government to government relations remain stable and nothing really changes on the ground. And so, Linah, there's this very interesting.
Can I just jump in and say something else?
Yeah, sure.
So one of the things also, and it's related to directly what you just mentioned about that resolution in the 90s, because you might recall that I started off explaining to you my memory of the cricket in 1990. In 1991, around 1991, 1992, well, precisely 91, there was this Madrid conference, right? And Israel said that they would not.
They're not gonna participate in the Madrid conference unless the United Nations revokes this.
And so the thing here is that India on one hand waits for Mandela to be released, right? And then sort of changes its policy. But in the case of Israel, there's no concession that takes place.
Yeah.
Right? And they just basically sign on the revocation of that resolution. And funny enough, there's a passage, J.N. Dixit, the Indian Foreign Secretary,
Yes.
between 91 and
Yes.
94, he writes that he regarded the establishment of relations with South Africa and then Israel as the most significant during his years in office. And there's no sense of irony about that, right?
Yeah, I wish I had actually I've ordered a paper copy because I realized that Liberty Books is holding some of copies of your book. So I've ordered two actually, but I read it. I got a soft copy of your book. So if I had the hard copy with me, then I would have just flagged it and read out from that. But I will come back to another very important thing, which is also very close to my heart, with reference to the Punch rebellion and uprising, which got us Azad Kashmir. But I want to, because there are these, there's this confluence of Kashmir, Palestine, South Africa, especially after the end of apartheid in South Africa, and how South Africa, starting with Nelson Mandela, basically came out in full support for Palestine. But before I return to that part of that, part of your book where you mentioned the uprising, it's interesting, and I won't get Linah's view on this, that I initially, and it's a confession of sorts, I initially was, in favor of the Oslo process. And then I happened to be at Columbia for a conference where I chanced to listen to the late Professor Edward Said. And then I also read his, this is some months into the second Intifada. So then I also read his article the morning after, which he had written for the time. When I heard him, I decided to go deeper into the issue, and I was stunned by the fact that I happened to chance upon this speech made by Yitzhak Rabin at the Knesset. This was for the ratification of Oslo II, and this was incidentally about 28 or 29 days before he was assassinated. And when I read that speech, I realized that Professor Said was absolutely right when he said that this was the Palestinian Versailles, because there was no concept of a Palestinian state. Rabin is absolutely clear about that in that speech to the Knesset, which is, on the record. And I realized I just completely changed my view of the Oslo process. So I just want to get your view of how the Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem look at that process. I know, because I've heard some really bad jokes about the Palestinian Authority from some of my Palestinian friends in terms of how they look at the PA. But now, with the benefit of the hindsight, how do Palestinians look at that process? Do they think that that was the process that has actually given them nothing or made their situation worse?
Absolutely. I mean, we're talking about, it's been more than 30 years of a fake Palestinian statehood. This was signed by leaders that were largely in exile that co-opted the First Intifada uprising because they were not part of that. The First Intifada was largely driven by mass civil disobedience. You had people organizing boycotts, protests, co-ops, to grow food when, the local economy suffered. And then you had a bunch of these Palestinian leaders living outside who wanted in on the cake, basically. They felt like they were being sidelined, that their role was growing increasingly irrelevant. And so spearheaded by Yasser Arafat, they struck a deal with Israel to, to the world, the optics, it looked amazing. Like finally, Israel, Palestine, they signed a peace deal. Oh, this intractable 2,000-year conflict or whatever, all this nonsense and all this propaganda. Signing the Oslo agreement on the White House lawn with Bill Clinton standing between Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat. Yes, it made, amazing optics. But the reality on the ground was that if Palestinians back then knew what exactly was happening, the Intifada would have switched from against the Israelis to these, non-representative political leaders living in exile. You look at the clauses of the Oslo Agreement, and it's honestly, it's so shameless to see what exactly these leaders sold out Palestine and the Palestinian cause for. There's no sense of any autonomy. There's no sense of clearly defined borders. They traded 78% of historic Palestine and agreed to stay in charge of the remaining 22%, which is the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. But even within the West Bank, this land was broken down even more into areas, area A, B, and C, each one according to different levels of Israeli civil and military control. So let's say, for example, Area C comprises 60% of the West Bank. So we're not even talking about 22%. We're talking about a much tinier fragment of territory, basically. And all for what? All for these people to, call themselves, oh, we are the leaders of this Palestinian state. But what was agreed on was that they would get rid of any sort of resistance to the Israeli occupation. So the Palestinian Authority was created as an interim government that was only supposed to last for 5 years before democratic elections could take place for Palestinians to choose their leaders. And that obviously never happened. In effect, the creation of the Palestinian Authority is, it's operating as a subcontractor for the Israeli occupation, meaning that they are making it much less costly to maintain the oppression of Palestinians. And Ramallah, which has become the de facto hub or capital of the West Bank, or the Palestinian Authority, I should say, you can see that. You can see the differences in, for example, the apartheid wall, the settlements that are increasingly growing and expanding, the 4 refugee camps in the city, or like there's 2 inside the city and 2 on the outskirts, juxtaposed to the villas of, these leaders of the Palestinian Authority. So, you're talking about an entire generation, which I'm a part of, that has been effectively excluded from any political decision-making or participation even. Even speaking out against the Palestinian Authority, that has become, or that has always been, grounds for arrest and torture. The PA prisons are notoriously known for their torture, and I spoke to some prisoners who spent time in both Israeli jails and Palestinian Authority prisons, and they told me that one day in a Palestinian Authority jail is like, one day in an Israeli prison is like 1,000 days in a Palestinian Authority prison, meaning that the torture that they face from their own people is actually worse. And I think you see that you see this pattern quite a lot with in colonial movements in countries that have had colonial pasts, basically, where there has always been a class that has benefited and operated, and worked in tandem with the colonizer to
Absolutely.
keep the rest of the population in check.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I think now, more than 3 decades later, the Palestinian Authority is a massive joke, but it's also still quite dangerous because they are, they're still arresting people for minor things such as like Facebook posts, for example. And we also see this on the Israeli side. The Israelis are arresting Palestinian citizens of Israel for example, saying, I don't know, free Palestine, for example. So, and then there's also like, the collaboration between the two governments is very much known. It's very, we call it like the revolving door policy, where it's not
Even the
unheard of.
Quisling,
Sorry?
PA is a Quisling. I mean, PA
Yeah,
is a collaborator. I mean, PA
yeah,
is basically there to suppress the Palestinians on behalf of the Israelis,
100%.
which is yet another similarity with occupied Kashmir. And as I mentioned, Azad has talked about the Punch rebellion. The simmering resentment and this desire to break the yoke of the Dogra Raja actually predates the partition of India and Pakistan. And almost simultaneously, in fact, just before partition, Punch was already simmering. After the Second World War, people had been demobilized. These were people who had the experience of fighting as soldiers in the Second World War, and they picked up guns, uh, cleared a large part of the Punch area, Muzaffarabad, and that was a time that in September the Dogra regime got so rattled that alongside the RSS cadres, they conducted a massacre in Jammu of the Muslims, which was a Muslim-dominated area. More than 30,000 people, by some estimates, up to 50,000 people were killed. Over 100,000 had to relocate to places like Sialkot and Gujranwala and some other places in Pakistan. And among other writers, one of the best work that came out about the Jammu massacre was by a Dogra writer and activist, Mr. Ved Bhasin, who was the founder editor of Kashmir Times, and who has written about this. So the Dogra Raja had absolutely no business, having lost control of his own territory, to sign an instrument, so-called instrument of accession with India. And Azad mentions that in his book. And then Sheikh Abdullah and Sheikh Abdullah's progenies and other collaborators, just like the Palestinian Authority in occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. So, Azad, before I close the program, this is yet another similarity that I would like to get your take on in terms of how these collaborators, or call them the Quislings, work for an oppressive occupying power.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Um, the figures that you mentioned may actually be uh, a conservative number, very conservative. There's historians actually put the number to you know, between 200 and 250,000 actually killed in that area in Jammu in 1947, and upwards of 500,000 that actually went across. So I think it's quite remarkable that this is kind of this massacre that has been erased, forgotten, and also kind of shoved to the side, especially when we consider what is going on today, in which you have like this, to speak directly to your question, we have Narendra Modi going to Kashmir to inaugurate this massive train project, right?
Yeah.
And you have Umar Abdullah there. It's quite remarkable, and I mean it's remarkable. It's ludicrous that you have a train service that's being created to join India to Indian occupied Kashmir, while you have not dealt with this massacre in 1947 that has created these divisions between families,
Yeah.
right, within Kashmir itself. So you have this fake border, this artificial border that's being created, and you want to create a bridge with India, and then you say that you're trying to connect and trying to improve the development, improve tourism, improve the infrastructure possibilities of this place, whereas actual people who live there want to be connected and reconnected with their own families, want accountability for what has happened over the past, 80 years. Excuse me. And so these puppet regimes have always functioned in that way. In South Africa, we call them these Bantustans, right?
Yeah,
You have
yeah.
the
They've tried to create
the same framing in Palestine as well, where you have these local actors that essentially take charge and become the native informer, basically, right?
Yeah.
Take charge of the native. They are even more brutal than the native. Than the actual occupying power, right? So I don't think enough has been written or spoken about with regards to their role in all of this. More needs to be done. In fact,
Yeah.
one of the interesting things about 2019 is that when India cut all the communications, created this like siege on Kashmir, not the same type of siege that you have on Gaza, but a communication siege, right? And a kind of what do you call it? Uh, uh, Basically making sure that no one is able to move within Kashmir. There's no communications. Everything is closed.
Yeah, complete blackout of communication,
Yeah,
and
all of these things, right? And the interesting thing about that is that the media, including the Western media, spoke about how these politicians, the Bantustan leaders, were also arrested, as if
yeah,
that was the red line in a way. It's sort of like, no, actually, like that doesn't mean anything, because in several years they're going to be brought back, right, to
yeah.
and help the Indian state conduct their project. It's continuous, this sort of revolving door, right?
Absolutely. Just to sorry, just one interjection. And they were so simultaneously what they were trying to do was to to sort of build up a third force as a kind of threatening gesture to these existing quislings, while these quislings were under house arrest, and ultimately got them to return to the oppressor's fold, which is basically the entire rationale for their politics in occupied Kashmir. And so all of it is back to where it used to be.
Yeah, 100%. And so it's kind of like, you see this relationship between all of these kind of actors, um, that don't have any sort of constituency, right? They don't have any legitimacy. So
Yeah,
you can take it back to someone like Elon Musk and Trump as well, where they perform these type of fights,
yeah,
and then they'll become best buddies again. You know, it's sort of the same, but on obviously of a different scope and a different scale. And I guess, before you round up this conversation, I think it's important for everyone to just remember that the situation in Palestine and Kashmir is not the same, right? And I think there's a lot of bad faith actors that try to basically say that when there's a comparison, with regards to militarization, with regards to tactics, uh, that people are saying that it's the same. It's not the same, but there is a methodology that's been taken from the Israelis, and India had their own methodologies before, but now it's sort of like it's been souped up with tactics and weapons, and we saw that with the latest war with Pakistan, right? We're using these drones, and the same thing is taking place with regards to surveillance, and all of those things. So I think um, I think people shouldn't be disparaged when there are bad faith sort of responses to these discussions as well, because there is something really deepening here, and it's not just in Kashmir. It's happening in other in parts of India, right? In the Basta region, where there's a rebellion taking place there. There's people's land is being taken away, but they are bombing the hell out of those people, right? These farmers and these tribals, right?
yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. So this has been a great discussion. I was just opened the it's open on the fifth chapter, Kashmir and Palestine: A Story of Two Occupations, uh, which starts with quotes from Perry Anderson and Edward Said, and also Noam Chomsky. Um, It's a great book. I will definitely recommend it to. We'll run the cover of the book also, and I would recommend it to all interested viewers who want to read it. This is one of those books, one of those works that creates these connections and basically sets a course for us to try and further investigate how these two countries, which are now in a tight embrace, are likely to stay in that embrace, frankly, for a number of reasons. I essentially, uh, Azad talked about the various, nuances of how India was dealing with Israel in the 60s and also in the 70s and 80s. But that fig leaf is now gone. There is no more fig leaf there. These two countries are partners in oppressing their respective minorities. In the case of Palestine, not a minority, but the original inhabitants of the land. But thank you so much. I'm sure we'll have further occasion to talk about these things. I'm really grateful, Linah, to you, and Azad, to you. This is all from this episode. If you like the discussion, click on the subscribe button. Doesn't get me any lucre, but it'll certainly make me happy. Until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.